Hi guys, and welcome to another episode of Kabir Considers. In this video, I'm going to react to life in the trenches during World War I. Now, this is going to be a great video just because it's hard to imagine what life must have been like in living in these conditions. You know, it was dirty, it was cold, it was damp, you know, like they were there for like days and days and days on end. I don't know how it worked. Like, I'm guessing, you know, there was a rotation system. So maybe whoever was at the front was only there for so long, maybe 3 or 4 days, and then they would rotate to the back. I don't know how it would work, but it just must have been awful. You know, you don't know when an attack is going to come in, like maybe a bombardment, maybe shelling, you know, like just a completely different kind of lifestyle. Like, even soldiers today, you know, I'm sure the conditions are probably a lot better than they were all those years ago. You know, World War I, we're talking what, 90 plus years ago now? So yeah, this video is going to really shed some light, you know, give me some perspective on what these men, you know, had to go through, you know. It's going to be a great video. Let's do it.
When it comes to the First World War, there's one thing that we all think of: trenches. Muddy, rat-infested hellholes with death around every corner. Places so bad that only going over the top could actually be worse. Trenches dominate our perspective. But are our perceptions actually accurate? Well, today we're going to answer 3 big questions. Why did trenches exist? What were they actually like? And how did the Allies manage to break the trench deadlock? But before we do that, a reminder to subscribe to the Imperial War Museum YouTube channel for more videos just like this every 2 weeks. So let's start simple. How prevalent were trenches during the First World War?
Well, trenches were really the defining concept of the First World War. They were literally on every front. The Western Front most famously in France and Belgium.
And a trench is basically like a tunnel system, right? Like or where they just dig sort of like ridges, you know, going into like a land like maybe a meter or 2 deep, so that they could like pop over and fire and then go back in to cover.
They're in Gallipoli, they're in the mountains of northern Italy, they're in the Middle East, even in Africa. Trenches were everywhere.
Which then begs the question, why? What did trenches offer to First World War armies?
I'm guessing protection.
Well, trenches are really an antidote to modern weaponry. When the First World War comes along, everybody thinks it's going to be a war of movement with masses of infantry and cavalry moving forward, classical old-style battle.
The reality, though, was very different. Attacking armies were confronted with previously unimaginable amounts of firepower, thanks to new warfighting technologies.
Machine guns are firing hundreds of bullets a minute. A modern magazine rifle that can fire 20 to 30 rounds a minute. And then you have artillery firing shrapnel. These are shells that explode in the air and fire lead bullets towards the enemy. An absolute killing zone can be created. It really puts the emphasis and the advantage with the defender. So they begin to dig in 1914 and they never stop until the end of the war.
Initially, trenches were seen as a temporary measure, one which armies would move on from soon enough. These early trenches were more like ditches, the kind you'd see at the side of a road today. But over the course of the war, they developed into more complex systems.
And you end up with a fire trench, which is your frontline trench, then a support trench, and then behind that a reserve trench. You've got 3 lines connected by what's called communication trenches, so that men and material and supplies can move up and down between the trench lines without having to go over open ground.
Wow.
As trench systems developed, sometimes particular trenches were given names to help identify them. As you
Wow, it's almost like a little neighborhood almost.
can see in this picture, sometimes those names related to familiar places from home.
If you look at the battlements of a castle and you lay them down on the ground, that's the pattern you get on a frontline trench. The idea is that if a shell lands in one of these bays, it's contained, the explosion's contained, so you cut down the casualty.
But at the same time, if you're in that specific area when a shell comes in, you've got very few options to get away. You've only got right or left, whereas if it's in open air, like you can like run in multiple directions. So I guess it is safer in that regard, but also like you don't want to be the unlucky soldier who's like sitting in the trench eating his potatoes and beef or whatever, and a shell just comes right in and lands in your lap. Be awful.
Though trench systems developed, life inside one was far more rudimentary. When able to rest, soldiers in frontline trenches would try and shelter from the elements in dugouts, and these varied from deep underground shelters to small hollows in the side of the trench, as shown here. Most activity in frontline trenches took place at night under the cover of darkness, while during daytime hours soldiers would try to get some rest, but were usually only able to sleep for a few hours at a time.
And of course, rats, they proliferate around the trenches. They feed on the dead bodies. Men would wake up with, face to face with a rat sitting on their chest. You also get problems in summer or in hotter climates from masses of flies. Of course, flies move from corpses to toilets to food, and that way spreading disease, such things as dysentery, etc. So just your basic daily life is pretty monotonous.
And if you think trench life is boring, the food was worse. According to Harold Mayle of the Durham Light...
The idea of waking up and seeing like rats like running around in front of me honestly like makes me feel sick.
Infantry, rations were very poor. You'd try to brew tea and you couldn't. It was always cold, and probably the water was all tasted of petrol because it came up in petrol tins, which were never cleaned out properly. And the tea was half petrol and cold. The food, they were supposed to give you bacon. Well, you were lucky if you got a piece of bacon. It was all cold and greasy. I mean, you couldn't get any. And the cooks, probably if a man was a chartered accountant, they'd make him a cook or something like that, because it was always square pegs in round holes, They couldn't cook. We used to say they couldn't boil water without spoiling it or something. The food was terrible.
Man, and that's like the key. People who go on like aircraft carriers or submarines for months on end, they make sure that the food is really good because, you want to keep the morale up in whatever way you can. So here they're living in awful conditions. They're cold, they're wet, they're dirty, and the food sucks. Must have been miserable.
Though the food was nothing compared to the ever-present danger.
An artillery shell, a sniper's bullet, those are two of the most almost random ways you can die. The shells supposedly aren't aimed, they're just aimed at a particular area of trench. And if you happen to be there at the wrong time, then potentially you're going to get killed.
One minute you were talking to your best mate, and the next minute he could be gone. And that almost random death.
Mate, I watched Band of Brothers. I've seen it like twice now because it's so good. The episode where they cover the Battle of Bastogne, where they're just getting shelled constantly, man, because they're on the front lines, and just the explosions all around. You would guarantee to get PTSD after that if you survived, like guaranteed PTSD.
Took a real psychological toll on the soldiers.
Yeah.
For that reason,
Shell
the
shock.
armies tried to rotate people through the line. So the idea, you'd stay in the front line for, say, 4 to 6 days, and then if possible, you'd
4
move back to the support line for a similar period of time, and the reserve line, and then you'd get a period of time actually behind the line.
Naturally, being behind the line was a favourite time for many soldiers.
Of course.
You could get a hot bath, a good night's sleep, and a
decent
clean
meal.
pair of clothes. Many played sports, took part in amateur dramatics, or even got to head back to Britain for home leave. During all this time, there were many attempts to break the deadlock. Large and small, new ideas were being continuously experimented with.
Man, it would really make you appreciate the small things in life, like living in these conditions. It makes me think sometimes, because, a lot of mental health problems seem to be at all-time highs right now, despite, we're living in a time of peace, you'd have to say. Whereas back then, these men, just being able to go home for 2 or 3 days would be like heaven to them. It puts things into perspective.
The First World War is almost like an arms race between the defence and the offence. so the defence develop a new way of holding ground, then the attacking side has to find a way of overcoming that. If they achieve that, then again the defence needs to come up with a new tactic.
Despite the many well-documented disasters from the Somme to Passchendaele, all the time armies were learning. Officers who had been trained on classical battle techniques were beginning to learn how trench warfare worked, while generals were beginning to master the management of giant armies.
And they try a number of things. They use massed artillery fire. So they have these, what they call barrage lifts, where they fire on set lines for a certain period of time, and they lift forward and fire again, and lift forward.
The recoil is just ridiculous.
And fire again. And the infantry follow up. They use poison gas as well. The idea of poison gas floating and then later shelled into the lines. The idea is it makes you put on a gas mask. Once you put a gas mask on, it's very hard to see or hear anything, it's hard to breathe, and it debilitates your ability to actually fight. In 1916, the British bring the tank onto the battlefield. Initially, it's not very successful. Later in the war, they redefine the tactics and the way it's used and the numbers of tanks used. They have new infantry tactics. You now have light machine guns, rifle grenades, trench mortars. The light machine guns, mortars, etc., lay down fire, and then the infantry would move forward and occupy a position. All of these weapons were invented at different times. And in 1918, for the Allies, they all come together.
At the Battle of Amiens in August 1918, the largest combined arms offensive of the war, the Allies were finally able to break the trench deadlock. Those 4 years of turgid learning finally brought about the resumption of open warfare.
4 years, man. Gosh, imagine you had to fight for 4 years, like living in these kind of conditions for that long. Change your life, man. You'd never be the same person.
Just one day, the Allies had made almost unheard of advances, pushing into the German line 11 kilometers deep on a 24-kilometer wide front. It was so successful that General Ludendorff called it the Black Day of the German army.
I think the trench captured public imagination probably goes down as the defining feature of the First World War. The current view is that every day was like the first day of the Somme, which it blatantly wasn't. Casualties were terrible and on a terrible scale, but we were fighting a total war at that time. The whole trench experience was a terrible experience, but the men fought through it, and they never lost sort of their faith in the fact that they had to fight that war to a successful conclusion. I think that's a really important part to draw out.
It is. Wow. Man, that video was incredible. Well done to everyone involved in making it. It's just, for me personally, it not only was fascinating, the subject matter and seeing the footage, particularly seeing the footage, it honestly gives me an appreciation for the life I live now. It really does, because, had the war not gone the way it did, my life would probably be very, very completely different, A. And B, it also puts into perspective, the relative comfort in which I and most of you guys live. Obviously, I know that we all have our problems. This isn't to minimize anyone's problems at all, but I'm sure most of us, the vast majority of us, would rather live the lives we're living now than have to live in a trench, fighting a bloody war, for years, It's really incredible, and it just makes me want, this conflict that we're seeing, in Ukraine to come to an end, because, peace is the best. Conflicts like this, the longer they go on, it could spiral out of control. It could continue to escalate. It's just, the video was fascinating to watch. Really, really enjoyed it. Thanks for watching, guys, and I'll see you in the next one.